Question 1. Governance review demonstrates that a senior executive at Kingboard Holdings, responsible for a significant upcoming acquisition, has a close personal relationship with a key executive at the target company. This relationship was not disclosed during the initial stages of the acquisition discussions. The senior executive is concerned that this undisclosed relationship could create a perceived or actual conflict of interest that might jeopardize the deal or raise regulatory concerns for Kingboard Holdings. What is the most appropriate immediate course of action for the senior executive? Option A. Continue with the acquisition discussions as planned, assuming the personal relationship will not influence professional judgment and that disclosure is unnecessary unless specifically asked. Option B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the Kingboard Holdings Compliance Department and the Board of Directors, requesting guidance on how to proceed and offering to recuse themselves from further discussions if deemed necessary. Option C. Proceed with the acquisition discussions, but make a mental note to address the relationship only if it becomes a significant obstacle or is raised by external parties. Option D. Discreetly inform the executive at the target company about the potential conflict and ask them to maintain strict confidentiality regarding their personal relationship during the acquisition process. Correct answer is B. Immediately disclose the personal relationship to the Kingboard Holdings Compliance Department and the Board of Directors, requesting guidance on how to proceed and offering to recuse themselves from further discussions if deemed necessary. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires navigating potential conflicts of interest and ensuring compliance with Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks, which likely emphasize transparency and fair dealing. The pressure to secure a significant deal for Kingboard Holdings must be balanced against the ethical obligation to avoid situations that could be perceived as, or actually are, improper influence or insider trading. Careful judgment is required to uphold the company's reputation and legal standing. The correct approach involves proactively disclosing the potential conflict of interest to the relevant internal authority at Kingboard Holdings and seeking guidance on how to proceed. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory compliance by prioritizing transparency and adherence to established procedures. Specifically, it aligns with principles of good corporate governance that mandate the identification and management of conflicts of interest to protect the company and its stakeholders. This proactive disclosure allows Kingboard Holdings to make an informed decision on how to manage the situation, potentially by recusing the individual from certain discussions or by implementing other safeguards. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the discussions without disclosure risks, violating Kingboard Holdings' internal conflict of interest policies, and potentially breaching regulatory requirements related to insider information or market abuse. The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as actual misconduct. Another incorrect approach of downplaying the relationship to avoid scrutiny fails to acknowledge the seriousness of potential conflicts and the importance of transparency. This can lead to a breach of trust and a violation of ethical standards. A further incorrect approach of relying solely on personal judgment without seeking internal guidance ignores the established governance structures designed to mitigate risks. This can result in decisions that are not aligned with Kingboard Holdings' risk appetite or regulatory obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This involves identifying potential conflicts of interest early, understanding the relevant internal policies and external regulations, seeking advice from appropriate internal departments, e.g., legal, compliance, documenting all decisions and actions, and acting with integrity and transparency at all times. When in doubt, err on the side of caution and seek clarification. Question 2. The performance metrics show a significant and sustained decline in a key operational efficiency indicator for a major division of Kingboard Holdings. This decline, if not addressed, could impact the company's reported profitability and potentially trigger certain disclosure obligations under the Hong Kong Stock Exchange listing rules. Considering the Kingboard Holdings hiring assessment test's emphasis on regulatory adherence, what is the most appropriate immediate course of action? Option A. Discuss the metrics informally with a few trusted colleagues to gauge their opinions before deciding on any action. Option B. Publicly announce the performance decline to the market immediately to ensure full transparency. Option C. Ignore the metrics as they are likely temporary fluctuations and do not warrant immediate attention. Option D. Conduct a detailed internal investigation to understand the root causes of the performance decline and consult with the internal compliance department regarding potential disclosure requirements. The correct answer is D. Conduct a detailed internal investigation to understand the root causes of the performance decline and consult with the internal compliance department regarding potential disclosure requirements. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to interpret performance data within the specific regulatory framework governing Kingboard Holdings operations, likely related to financial reporting, compliance, or operational efficiency, as per the Kingboard Holdings hiring assessment test guidelines. The challenge lies in identifying the most appropriate course of action based on a nuanced understanding of these regulations, rather than a purely intuitive or generalized business response. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed action aligns with Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and external legal obligations, avoiding any misrepresentation or non-compliance. The correct approach involves a thorough review of Kingboard Holdings' internal compliance policies and relevant Hong Kong Stock Exchange (HKEX) listing rules, which are the presumed regulatory framework for a company like Kingboard Holdings. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to established governance and disclosure standards. Specifically, it would involve identifying if the performance metrics indicate a breach of any reporting requirements, a potential misstatement of financial information, or a deviation from operational standards that necessitates disclosure or corrective action under HKEX rules. This ensures transparency and integrity in reporting, which are fundamental ethical and regulatory principles. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the performance metrics as mere fluctuations without considering their potential regulatory implications. This fails to acknowledge the duty of care and diligence expected of employees in a publicly listed company. Another incorrect approach would be to immediately escalate the issue to external regulators without first consulting internal compliance departments or following established internal reporting procedures. This bypasses internal controls and could lead to unnecessary alarm or premature disclosure, potentially violating HKEX disclosure obligations or internal communication protocols. A third incorrect approach might be to attempt to manage the perception of the metrics internally without addressing the underlying performance issues or their potential regulatory impact, which could be seen as an attempt to mislead or obscure information. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory context. This involves identifying the relevant laws, listing rules, and internal policies. Next, they should analyze the situation against these established standards. If a potential issue is identified, the framework dictates following internal reporting lines and compliance procedures. This ensures that any necessary actions are taken in a structured, compliant, and ethical manner, protecting both the company and its stakeholders. Question 3. Examination of the data shows that Kingboard Holdings is considering a public announcement regarding a new strategic initiative. Internal projections indicate significant potential revenue growth, but also highlight substantial upfront investment costs and a period of operational uncertainty. A senior executive suggests focusing the announcement primarily on the projected revenue growth to generate positive market sentiment, while briefly mentioning the investments without detailing the associated risks or the timeline for profitability. Option A. Issue a preliminary announcement focusing solely on the strategic initiative's existence and its potential to drive future growth, deferring any financial projections or investment details to a later, more comprehensive disclosure. Option B. Craft an announcement that heavily emphasizes the projected revenue growth, downplays the scale and risks of the upfront investment, and omits specific details about the operational uncertainty to create a more optimistic market perception. Option C. Proceed with an announcement that emphasizes the potential revenue growth, provides a high-level overview of the investment, and includes a disclaimer about inherent uncertainties, ensuring all statements are factually accurate and not misleading. Option D. Delay the announcement until the operational uncertainties are fully resolved and the profitability timeline is definitively established, even if this means missing a perceived opportune market window. The correct answer is C. Proceed with an announcement that emphasizes the potential revenue growth, provides a high-level overview of the investment and includes a disclaimer about inherent uncertainties, ensuring all statements are factually accurate and not misleading. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid growth and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Kingboard Holdings, like any publicly listed entity, operates within a framework that mandates transparency and accurate disclosure. The challenge lies in balancing commercial pressures with legal and ethical obligations, requiring a nuanced understanding of the relevant regulatory landscape. Careful judgment is paramount to avoid misinterpretations or omissions that could lead to regulatory breaches. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented review of all relevant information, including internal reports and external market data, to ensure that any public statements made by Kingboard Holdings are accurate, complete, and not misleading. This aligns with the principles of fair dealing and market abuse prevention, which are central to maintaining investor confidence. Specifically, adherence to the disclosure obligations under the relevant securities laws and stock exchange listing rules is critical. This approach prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct, safeguarding both the company and its stakeholders. An incorrect approach that involves selectively presenting information to highlight positive aspects while downplaying or omitting negative ones would constitute a breach of disclosure regulations. This can be construed as market manipulation or misleading conduct, as it distorts the true financial or operational position of Kingboard Holdings. Another incorrect approach, that of relying solely on anecdotal evidence or unverified rumors for public statements, fails to meet the standard of due diligence and accuracy required by regulators. This demonstrates a lack of professional skepticism and a disregard for the integrity of information disseminated to the market. A third incorrect approach, which is to delay or obstruct the provision of requested information to regulatory bodies, directly contravenes the cooperative and transparent relationship expected between listed companies and their supervisors, leading to potential penalties and reputational damage. Professionals tasked with such decision should employ a structured reasoning process. This involves first identifying the core regulatory requirements applicable to Kingboard Holdings. Second, they must critically assess all available information against these requirements, seeking to understand the complete picture rather than isolated data points. Third, they should consult with legal and compliance departments to ensure interpretations of regulations are sound and that proposed actions are compliant. Finally, a commitment to transparency and accuracy, even when commercially inconvenient, should guide the decision-making process. Question 4. Assessment of an employee at Kingboard Holdings who has learned through a close personal friend, who is a senior executive at a competitor company, that the competitor is about to announce a significant acquisition that will likely impact Kingboard Holdings' market position. The employee is considering investing in the competitor's stock before the announcement. What is the most appropriate course of action for the employee? Option A. Discuss the potential investment with a trusted colleague at Kingboard Holdings to gauge their opinion before making a decision. Option B. Invest in the competitor's stock, as the information is not yet public and represents a legitimate investment opportunity. Option C. Immediately disclose the information and the intention to invest to the compliance department at Kingboard Holdings and await their guidance. Option D. Proceed with the investment, as the information was obtained through a personal relationship and not directly from Kingboard Holdings' internal dealings. The correct answer is C. Immediately disclose the information and the intention to invest to the compliance department at Kingboard Holdings and await their guidance. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Kingboard Holdings due to the potential conflict between personal interests and the company's ethical standards and regulatory obligations. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining integrity and avoiding any perception of impropriety or insider trading, which are strictly prohibited under financial regulations and company policy. Careful judgment is required to navigate situations where personal relationships might intersect with business dealings, ensuring that all actions are transparent, fair, and compliant. The correct approach involves immediate and transparent disclosure of the potential conflict of interest to the appropriate internal authority at Kingboard Holdings. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and regulatory compliance, which mandate that employees act in the best interests of the company and its shareholders. By reporting the situation, The employee allows Kingboard Holdings to assess the situation, implement necessary safeguards, and make informed decisions to prevent any breach of regulations or ethical guidelines. This proactive step demonstrates a commitment to honesty and adherence to the Kingboard Holdings Code of Conduct and relevant financial market regulations concerning conflicts of interest and insider information. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the investment without disclosure would constitute a serious regulatory and ethical failure. It bypasses the company's internal controls designed to prevent conflicts of interest and potential insider trading. This could lead to legal repercussions for both the individual and Kingboard Holdings, including fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach of seeking advice from a colleague without reporting to management fails to involve the designated authority responsible for managing such conflicts and ensuring compliance. This informal consultation does not absolve the employee of their responsibility to formally declare the conflict, and could still lead to a breach if the advice is inadequate or if the situation escalates. Finally, assuming the relationship is purely personal and therefore not a conflict is a dangerous oversight. In a professional context, even perceived conflicts can have significant implications for market confidence and regulatory scrutiny, requiring disclosure regardless of the employee's personal assessment of its impact. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes transparency, compliance, and ethical conduct. This involves first identifying any potential conflict of interest, however minor it may seem. Second, they must consult the relevant company policies and regulatory guidelines to understand their obligations. Third, they should err on the side of caution by disclosing the situation to the appropriate internal body or supervisor. Fourth, they must follow the guidance provided by the company to mitigate any risks. This systematic approach ensures that personal interests do not compromise professional duties or violate regulatory requirements. Question 5. Which approach would be most appropriate for a Kingboard Holdings employee who has recently been privy to preliminary, non-public information regarding a potential significant acquisition by the company and is considering trading shares of a supplier to that potential acquisition target? Option A. Immediately disclose the situation to Kingboard Holdings Compliance Department and await their guidance before making any trading decisions. Option B. Make the trade discreetly, ensuring the transaction is small enough not to attract attention, and assume the information is not material enough to warrant disclosure. Option C. Consult with a personal legal advisor to understand personal trading risks, but proceed with the trade if the advisor indicates no direct breach of law. Option D. Proceed with the trade as the information relates to a supplier and not directly to Kingboard Holdings shares, and personal trades are generally permitted. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the trade as the information relates to a supplier and not directly to Kingboard Holdings shares, and personal trades are generally permitted. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge for an employee at Kingboard Holdings due to the potential conflict between personal financial interests and their fiduciary duty to the company. The core of the challenge lies in maintaining objectivity and avoiding insider trading or the appearance of impropriety, which are strictly regulated. Careful judgment is required to navigate these situations ethically and legally, ensuring that Kingboard Holdings' reputation and compliance standards are upheld. The correct approach involves prioritizing transparency and adherence to Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and relevant securities regulations. This means proactively disclosing the potential conflict and seeking explicit approval before engaging in any trading activity. This approach is justified by the regulatory framework governing listed companies and their employees, which emphasizes preventing market abuse, insider dealing, and conflicts of interest. Adherence to these principles protects investors, maintains market integrity, and safeguards the company's standing. An incorrect approach would be to trade without disclosure, assuming personal knowledge is not material or that the trades are insignificant. This fails to acknowledge the strict regulations against insider trading and the broader ethical obligation to avoid even the appearance of a conflict. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on personal judgment about the materiality of the information, bypassing established internal procedures. This disregards the company's compliance framework and the potential for misinterpretation of what constitutes material non-public information, leading to regulatory breaches. Finally, attempting to obscure the trades or their connection to the information would be a clear violation of securities laws and ethical standards, constituting deliberate deception. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying potential conflicts of interest. This involves understanding Kingboard Holdings' specific policies on trading by employees and directors, as well as the relevant securities laws. The next step is to err on the side of caution by disclosing any potential conflict to the appropriate compliance department or supervisor. Seeking clear, written approval before proceeding with any action that could be perceived as a conflict is crucial. This proactive and transparent approach mitigates risk and ensures compliance with both internal rules and external regulations. Question 6. Implementation of a new investor presentation by Kingboard Holdings is being considered, which highlights recent successes and future growth prospects. However, the investor relations team is aware of an ongoing material regulatory investigation that could potentially impact the company's financial performance and reputation. The draft presentation focuses exclusively on the positive aspects and does not mention the investigation. What is the most appropriate course of action for Kingboard Holdings' investor relations team? Option A. Proceed with the presentation as drafted, as it focuses on the company's strengths and future outlook, which is standard practice for investor outreach. Option B. Revise the presentation to include a clear and specific disclosure of the ongoing regulatory investigation, its potential implications, and any mitigating steps being taken by Kingboard Holdings. Option C. Include a general disclaimer in the presentation stating that the company is subject to various regulatory environments and potential challenges, without detailing the specific investigation. Option D. Postpone the investor presentation indefinitely until the regulatory investigation is fully concluded and all outcomes are known. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the presentation as drafted, as it focuses on the company's strengths and future outlook, which is standard practice for investor outreach. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's strategic growth objectives and the stringent regulatory requirements governing financial disclosures and market conduct. Kingboard Holdings, as a publicly listed entity, is obligated to ensure all communications with the market are accurate, not misleading, and timely. The pressure to secure investment can create an environment where the temptation to present information in the most favorable light, potentially omitting or downplaying negative aspects, is high. This requires careful judgment to balance commercial imperatives with legal and ethical duties. The correct approach involves Kingboard Holdings' investor relations team meticulously reviewing the proposed presentation to ensure it aligns with all applicable disclosure obligations. This means verifying that all material information, both positive and negative, is presented in a balanced and factual manner, avoiding any exaggeration or omission that could mislead potential investors. This approach is justified by the regulatory framework that mandates fair disclosure and prohibits market manipulation. Specifically, it upholds the principles of transparency and integrity essential for maintaining investor confidence and the orderly functioning of the financial markets. Adherence to these principles prevents the company from facing regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and legal liabilities. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the presentation as drafted, focusing solely on the positive aspects and omitting any mention of the ongoing regulatory investigation. This would be a direct violation of disclosure requirements, as it constitutes a material omission that could significantly influence an investor's decision. Such an omission is misleading and could be interpreted as an attempt to artificially inflate the company's perceived value, thereby breaching market abuse regulations. Another incorrect approach would be to include a vague, non-specific disclaimer about potential regulatory challenges without providing any context or detail. While seemingly an attempt to acknowledge risk, this is insufficient if the investigation is material. Regulators expect specific and clear disclosure of material risks, and a generic disclaimer would likely be deemed inadequate, failing to inform investors of the true nature and potential impact of the investigation. A further incorrect approach would be to delay the presentation indefinitely until the investigation is fully resolved. While this might seem cautious, it could also be detrimental to the company's legitimate business operations and investor relations, potentially leading to accusations of withholding information or creating uncertainty in the market. The regulatory expectation is not necessarily to halt all communication, but to ensure that all communication is accurate and complete regarding material information. The professional decision-making process for Kingboard Holdings in this situation should involve a structured risk assessment. This includes identifying all relevant disclosure obligations, evaluating the materiality of the ongoing investigation, and consulting with legal and compliance departments to ensure any public communication is accurate, balanced, and compliant. The team should prioritize transparency and accuracy, even if it means presenting information that is less favorable than initially desired, to uphold regulatory standards and maintain market integrity. Question 7. The risk matrix shows that the target company for Kingboard Holdings' potential acquisition has several outstanding regulatory compliance issues that could significantly impact its future operations and profitability. Kingboard Holdings' management is under pressure to complete the acquisition quickly to capitalize on current market conditions. Which of the following actions best reflects a responsible and compliant approach for Kingboard Holdings? Option A. Immediately proceed with the acquisition, assuming the compliance issues are manageable and can be resolved after the deal closes. Option B. Withdraw from the acquisition immediately due to the presence of compliance issues without further investigation. Option C. Conduct a thorough due diligence investigation into the nature and extent of the compliance issues. Engage with the target company's management and legal counsel to understand their remediation plans, and assess the financial and operational impact before finalizing the acquisition. Option D. Proceed with the acquisition, but disclose the existence of compliance issues without detailing their potential impact or the steps being taken to address them. The correct answer is A. Immediately proceed with the acquisition, assuming the compliance issues are manageable and can be resolved after the deal closes. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires Kingboard Holdings to balance the immediate financial pressures of a potential acquisition with its ongoing regulatory obligations and ethical responsibilities to its stakeholders. The pressure to secure a favorable deal could tempt management to overlook or downplay certain risks, but doing so would expose the company to significant legal, reputational, and financial repercussions. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all due diligence is conducted thoroughly and that disclosures are accurate and complete, even under time constraints. The correct approach involves Kingboard Holdings proactively engaging with the target company's management and legal counsel to understand the full scope of the identified compliance issues and to assess their potential impact on the acquisition's valuation and feasibility. This approach aligns with the principles of responsible corporate governance and regulatory compliance. Specifically, it demonstrates a commitment to thorough due diligence, which is a cornerstone of sound M&A practices and is implicitly or explicitly required by various corporate laws and listing rules that mandate accurate disclosure and prudent risk management. By seeking to quantify and mitigate these risks before finalizing the acquisition, Kingboard Holdings acts in the best interests of its shareholders and adheres to the spirit of regulatory frameworks that aim to prevent the acquisition of companies with undisclosed or unmanaged material liabilities. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the acquisition without fully understanding or disclosing the compliance issues would represent a failure to conduct adequate due diligence. This could lead to breaches of disclosure obligations under relevant securities laws and listing rules, potentially resulting in regulatory investigations, fines, and shareholder lawsuits. Another incorrect approach, that of immediately withdrawing from the acquisition without further investigation, might be overly cautious and could result in missed strategic opportunities and potential shareholder dissatisfaction for failing to explore all viable avenues. A third incorrect approach, which is to assume the compliance issues are minor and can be resolved post-acquisition without detailed assessment, ignores the potential for these issues to escalate, leading to unforeseen costs and operational disruptions, and also fails to meet the duty of care owed to shareholders to make informed investment decisions. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making framework that prioritizes thorough risk assessment and transparent communication. This involves 1. Identifying all potential risks and their implications. 2. Quantifying the impact of these risks where possible. 3. Developing mitigation strategies. 4. Consulting with legal and compliance experts. 5. Ensuring all disclosures are accurate and complete in accordance with applicable regulations. 6. Making decisions based on a comprehensive understanding of the risks and potential rewards, rather than solely on immediate financial incentives. Question 8. During the evaluation of a potential acquisition by Kingboard Holdings that involves cross-border elements and the transfer of significant intellectual property, What is the most prudent course of action to ensure full compliance with all applicable securities laws and listing rules? Option A. Prioritize the speed of the transaction to gain a competitive advantage, deferring detailed regulatory checks until after the deal is signed. Option B. Rely on the legal counsel of the target company to guide Kingboard Holdings through the regulatory approval process, as they will be most familiar with the local regulations. Option C. Proceed with the acquisition based on the assessment of its strategic benefits, assuming that any minor regulatory issues can be addressed post-completion. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive review of all relevant securities laws and the listing rules of the stock exchange on which Kingboard Holdings is listed, seeking specialist legal and compliance advice to identify and mitigate any potential compliance risks before finalizing the transaction. Correct answer is C. Proceed with the acquisition based on the assessment of its strategic benefits, assuming that any minor regulatory issues can be addressed post-completion. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for growth and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Kingboard Holdings, like any publicly listed entity, must navigate these requirements meticulously. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying complex regulation to real-world business decisions, ensuring that strategic initiatives do not inadvertently lead to non-compliance. Careful judgment is required to balance commercial objectives with legal and ethical obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding and application of the relevant listing rules and securities regulations governing Kingboard Holdings. This means proactively identifying potential conflicts or areas of ambiguity in proposed transactions and seeking expert legal and compliance advice. The justification for this approach is rooted in the fundamental principles of corporate governance and regulatory compliance. Adhering to these rules is not merely a legal obligation, but an ethical imperative to maintain investor confidence and the integrity of the financial markets. Specifically, this approach upholds the duty of care owed to shareholders and the public by ensuring transparency, fairness, and adherence to established legal frameworks. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with a transaction without fully assessing its regulatory implications, assuming that the commercial benefits outweigh potential compliance issues. This demonstrates a failure to exercise due diligence and a disregard for the regulatory framework. Such an approach risks significant penalties, reputational damage, and potential legal action. Another incorrect approach would be to rely solely on internal interpretations of regulations without consulting qualified legal or compliance professionals. This can lead to misinterpretations and oversights, as internal teams may lack the specialized knowledge required to navigate complex regulatory landscapes. A further incorrect approach is to prioritize speed of execution over thorough regulatory review, believing that a transaction can be fixed later if issues arise. This is a fundamentally flawed strategy that undermines the preventative nature of regulatory compliance and exposes the company to unacceptable risks. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance as a foundational element of any strategic initiative. This involves a multi-step process. First, clearly defining the proposed action and its objectives. Second, identifying all potentially applicable regulations and listing rules. Third, conducting a comprehensive risk assessment including regulatory and compliance risks. Fourth, seeking expert advice from legal and compliance departments or external counsel. Fifth, developing mitigation strategies for identified risks. And finally, obtaining necessary approvals and ensuring proper documentation before proceeding. This structured approach ensures that business decisions are made with a full understanding of their legal and ethical ramifications. Question 9. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood of a significant price impact if certain non-public information regarding a competitor's product launch were to become widely known. An employee at Kingboard Holdings has overheard a conversation that appears to contain details of this competitor's confidential product specifications, which are not yet public. Employee is considering whether this information is material enough to warrant further investigation, or if it falls outside the scope of Kingboard Holdings' insider trading policy. Option A. Immediately report the overheard conversation to Kingboard Holdings' compliance department, providing all details of the conversation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. Option B. Assume the information is not material as it was overheard and not directly communicated, and continue with normal business activities without reporting it. Option C. Discuss the overheard conversation with colleagues to gauge their opinion on its materiality before making a decision on whether to report it. Option D. Conduct independent research to determine the competitor's product specifications and their potential market impact before deciding whether to report the overheard conversation. The correct answer is A. Immediately report the overheard conversation to Kingboard Holdings' Compliance Department, providing all details of the conversation and requesting guidance on how to proceed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Kingboard Holdings to interpret a risk matrix and apply it to a specific situation involving potential conflicts of interest and insider information. The challenge lies in distinguishing between legitimate business information and material non-public information, and understanding the ethical and regulatory implications of acting upon the latter. Careful judgment is required to ensure compliance with Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks, preventing market abuse and maintaining the integrity of financial markets. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of Kingboard Holdings' Code of Conduct and relevant securities regulations. It requires a proactive stance of seeking clarification from the Compliance Department when in doubt about the nature of information or the appropriateness of an action. This approach prioritizes adherence to established ethical guidelines and legal requirements, demonstrating a commitment to responsible conduct. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of preventing insider dealing and managing conflicts of interest, which are fundamental to maintaining investor confidence and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to assume the information is not material or to proceed without seeking guidance, especially if there is any ambiguity. This could lead to violations of insider trading laws, which carry severe penalties for individuals and the company. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the information as irrelevant without proper assessment, potentially overlooking a genuine risk or opportunity that should be handled through appropriate channels. Acting solely on personal judgment, without consulting internal policies or compliance personnel, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive information, is a significant ethical and regulatory failure. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that emphasizes a when in doubt, ask principle. This involves 1. Identifying the nature of the information received. 2. Assessing its potential materiality and whether it is non-public. 3. Consulting Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and code of conduct. 4. If any uncertainty remains, immediately escalating the matter to the Compliance Department or legal counsel for guidance. This structured approach ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically sound, mitigating risks for both the individual and the company. Question 10. Performance analysis shows that a junior analyst at Kingboard Holdings has identified a significant, non-public operational improvement within a key supplier that is expected to materially impact Kingboard Holdings' future profitability. The analyst is aware that a significant share purchase by Kingboard Holdings in this supplier is being considered by senior management. The analyst's immediate supervisor, who is aware of the potential share purchase, suggests that the analyst proceed with a personal investment in the supplier's shares before the company makes its decision, citing the potential for personal financial gain. Option A. The analyst should proceed with the personal investment as suggested by the supervisor, as it represents a personal financial opportunity. Option B. The analyst should discreetly inform the supplier's management about the potential impact of the operational improvement and gauge their reaction before making any personal investment decision. Option C. The analyst should disregard the supervisor's suggestion and refrain from any personal investment, but take no further action as it is a personal decision. Option D. The analyst should immediately report the situation and the supervisor's suggestion to Kingboard Holdings' Compliance Department and await their guidance before taking any action. The correct answer is D. The analyst should immediately report the situation and the supervisor's suggestion to Kingboard Holdings' Compliance Department and await their guidance before taking any action. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the company's immediate financial interests with their ethical and regulatory obligations. Kingboard Holdings, like any publicly listed entity, operates under a strict regulatory environment that prioritizes transparency, fair dealing, and the prevention of market abuse. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying these regulations to a situation where a potential conflict of interest or insider information might be present, even if not explicitly stated. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could be perceived as manipulative or that exploit non-public information, which could lead to severe reputational damage and legal penalties for both the individual and Kingboard Holdings. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented internal review process that prioritizes compliance with Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks. This approach acknowledges the potential sensitivity of the information and seeks to mitigate risks by involving appropriate internal stakeholders, such as the compliance department or legal counsel. This ensures that any decision made is informed by expert advice and adheres to the spirit and letter of the law, safeguarding the integrity of the market and the company's reputation. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and market conduct expected of listed companies and their employees. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the transaction without further inquiry or consultation fails to acknowledge the potential regulatory implications. This could be interpreted as a disregard for compliance procedures and a willingness to engage in potentially risky behavior. Such an action could violate regulations concerning insider trading or market manipulation if the information is indeed material and non-public, or if the transaction is perceived as an attempt to influence market perception. Another incorrect approach, which is to immediately dismiss the concern without any form of investigation, is also professionally unsound. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to uphold the duty of care expected of employees in sensitive roles. It risks overlooking genuine regulatory breaches or ethical lapses, leaving Kingboard Holdings exposed to significant risks. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Identify the potential issue. Recognize when a situation might involve sensitive information or a conflict of interest. 2. Consult internal policies and regulations. Refer to Kingboard Holdings' Code of Conduct, compliance manuals, and any relevant regulatory guidelines. 3. Seek expert advice. Engage with the compliance department, legal counsel, or senior management as appropriate. 4. Document all actions and decisions. Maintain a clear record of the steps taken, the information reviewed, and the rationale behind the final decision. 5. Act with integrity and transparency. Ensure all actions are ethical, legal, and defensible. Question 11. The monitoring system demonstrates a pattern of transactions that, at first glance, appears to deviate from standard operating procedures at Kingboard Holdings. However, the specific regulatory framework governing these transactions is complex and has several exceptions. Which of the following represents the most appropriate initial response for a compliance officer at Kingboard Holdings? Option A. Immediately escalate the matter for a full-scale internal investigation and report a potential breach to the relevant authorities. Option B. Instruct the IT department to disable the monitoring system to prevent further alerts until the situation can be assessed. Option C. Issue a company-wide memo to all employees reminding them of general compliance policies without referencing the specific system alert. Option D. Conduct a detailed review of the specific transactions against the precise wording and exceptions within the applicable regulatory framework to determine if a breach has occurred. Correct answer is A. Immediately escalate the matter for a full-scale internal investigation and report a potential breach to the relevant authorities. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Kingboard Holdings to interpret complex information from a monitoring system and apply it to a regulatory requirement without resorting to simplistic or potentially misleading interpretations. The challenge lies in distinguishing between a genuine regulatory breach and a situation that, while flagged, may not constitute a violation under the specific rules governing Kingboard Holdings operations. Careful judgment is required to avoid overreacting or underreacting, both of which could have significant compliance and reputational consequences. The correct approach involves a thorough, evidence-based assessment that directly addresses the specific regulatory framework applicable to Kingboard Holdings. This approach is right because it prioritizes accuracy and adherence to the law. It involves understanding the nuances of the relevant regulations, comparing the system's output against these specific rules, and seeking clarification or further investigation only when a potential breach is clearly identified. This aligns with the ethical duty of care and the regulatory obligation to maintain compliance, ensuring that actions taken are proportionate and legally sound. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the system's alert without contextualizing it against the specific regulatory framework is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of understanding of the applicable laws and guidelines, leading to a misinterpretation of the data. It risks triggering unnecessary investigations or actions, wasting resources, and potentially damaging the company's reputation or relationships based on incomplete information. Another incorrect approach that involves making assumptions or extrapolating beyond the direct evidence provided by the monitoring system, without further verification against the regulatory requirements, is also professionally flawed. This demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to adhere to the principle of evidence-based decision-making. It can lead to incorrect conclusions and inappropriate actions, violating the trust placed in the individual to act responsibly and in accordance with Kingboard Holdings' compliance obligations. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the relevant regulatory landscape. When presented with data from a monitoring system, the next step is to critically evaluate this data against the specific requirements of that framework. This involves asking, does this data, on its face, indicate a violation of a specific rule? If not, what further information or context is needed to make that determination? If a potential violation is indicated, the process should involve gathering all relevant evidence, consulting with compliance officers or legal counsel if necessary, and then taking appropriate measured action. This structured, evidence-driven process ensures that decisions are robust, defensible, and aligned with both regulatory requirements and ethical standards. Question 12. The assessment process reveals that a candidate for a position at Kingboard Holdings has a close family member who is a significant supplier to a division of Kingboard Holdings. The candidate is applying for a role that would involve oversight of procurement decisions within that division. Which of the following approaches best demonstrates professional integrity and adherence to ethical standards expected by Kingboard Holdings? Option A. Assume the family relationship is not significant enough to warrant disclosure, as it is a personal matter and does not directly involve the candidate's personal finances. Option B. Wait to see if a specific procurement decision arises that directly benefits the family member before considering any disclosure. Option C. Discuss the situation informally with a fellow candidate to gauge their opinion on whether disclosure is necessary before making a decision. Option D. Proactively disclose the family relationship and the potential conflict of interest to the hiring manager and HR department at Kingboard Holdings, and offer to recuse themselves from any procurement decisions directly impacting their family member's business. The correct answer is D. Proactively disclose the family relationship and the potential conflict of interest to the hiring manager and HR department at Kingboard Holdings, and offer to recuse themselves from any procurement decisions directly impacting their family member's business. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a candidate applying to Kingboard Holdings, requiring them to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ethical considerations within a corporate context. The challenge lies in identifying and appropriately managing situations where personal interests could improperly influence professional judgment or actions, thereby upholding the integrity of Kingboard Holdings and its stakeholders. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable situations, ensuring compliance with Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves proactively identifying and disclosing any potential conflicts of interest to the appropriate authority within Kingboard Holdings. This aligns with fundamental ethical principles of transparency and integrity, and is a standard requirement in most corporate governance frameworks and hiring processes. By disclosing, the candidate allows Kingboard Holdings to assess the situation and implement necessary safeguards, such as recusal from certain decisions or activities, thereby preventing any actual or perceived impropriety. This demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and a respect for the company's governance standards. Incorrect approaches analysis. An approach that involves downplaying or omitting the disclosure of a potential conflict of interest is professionally unacceptable. This failure constitutes a breach of ethical duty and potentially violates Kingboard Holdings' internal policies on conflicts of interest, as well as general principles of corporate governance that mandate transparency. Such an omission can lead to serious reputational damage for both the individual and the company, and may have legal ramifications. Another incorrect approach is to assume that the conflict is minor and therefore does not require disclosure. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the importance of even seemingly small conflicts, which can escalate or create an appearance of impropriety. Professional standards require a conservative approach to conflict identification and disclosure, erring on the side of transparency. Finally, an approach that involves seeking advice from a peer without formally disclosing the situation to Kingboard Holdings is also flawed. While seeking advice is generally good practice, it does not absolve the candidate of their direct responsibility to disclose to the company. Informal advice may not fully grasp the specific regulatory or policy implications relevant to Kingboard Holdings. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a proactive and transparent approach to potential conflicts of interest. The decision-making process should involve 1. Actively identifying any situation where personal interests, financial, familial, or otherwise, could potentially influence professional duties or decisions related to Kingboard Holdings. 2. Consulting Kingboard Holdings' internal code of conduct or conflict of interest policy to understand specific disclosure requirements. 3. Promptly and fully disclosing any identified potential conflicts to the designated person or department within Kingboard Holdings. 4. Cooperating with Kingboard Holdings to implement any agreed-upon mitigation strategies. This systematic approach ensures ethical conduct and compliance. Question 13. Risk assessment procedures indicate that Kingboard Holdings is facing potential significant financial impacts due to newly enacted stringent environmental regulations. An internal discussion among senior management is considering the timing of disclosing this information to the market, with some advocating for a delay to allow for further analysis and potential mitigation strategies to be developed and communicated. What is the most appropriate course of action for Kingboard Holdings in this situation? Option A. Immediately assess the potential financial impact of the new environmental regulations, and, if deemed material, proceed with prompt public disclosure in accordance with applicable listing rules and securities laws. Option B. Delay public disclosure of the potential financial impact until a comprehensive mitigation plan is fully developed and implemented. To present a more positive outlook to investors, Option C. Inform key institutional investors privately about the potential impact before making a public announcement to gauge their reaction and prepare them. Option D. Issue a general statement acknowledging that the company is reviewing the impact of new environmental regulations without specifying the potential financial consequences. The correct answer is A. Immediately assess the potential financial impact of the new environmental regulations, and if deemed material, proceed with prompt public disclosure in accordance with applicable listing rules and securities laws. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Kingboard Holdings, as a publicly listed entity, is subject to stringent regulatory requirements regarding the disclosure of material information. The internal discussion about the potential impact of the new environmental regulations on profitability requires careful consideration of what constitutes material information and when it must be disclosed to the market. The pressure to delay disclosure for strategic reasons, while understandable from a business perspective, directly conflicts with the regulatory obligation to provide timely and accurate information to investors. Professional judgment is required to balance commercial interests with legal and ethical duties. The correct approach involves immediate escalation of the potential impact of the environmental regulations to the appropriate internal compliance and legal teams, followed by a thorough assessment of materiality. If deemed material, prompt disclosure to the market, in accordance with the relevant listing rules and securities laws, is imperative. This ensures transparency and fairness to all investors, preventing insider trading and maintaining market integrity. This aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the regulatory framework governing listed companies, which prioritizes investor protection through timely and accurate information dissemination. An incorrect approach would be to delay disclosure based on the hope that the impact might be less severe than initially anticipated, or to wait for a more opportune time to announce the news. This failure to disclose material information promptly violates the regulatory obligation for timely disclosure. Another incorrect approach would be to selectively disclose the information to a limited group of stakeholders before public announcement, which constitutes insider trading and a breach of market abuse regulations. Finally, attempting to downplay the potential negative impact in any internal discussions or preliminary disclosures without a full and accurate assessment would be misleading and a violation of disclosure obligations. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves understanding the relevant disclosure obligations, assessing potential impacts with a conservative and objective lens, consulting with legal and compliance experts, and acting with integrity to ensure fair and transparent market operations. When in doubt about materiality or disclosure timing, erring on the side of caution and seeking expert advice is always the most prudent course of action. Question 14. Market research demonstrates a significant growth opportunity in a new emerging market for Kingboard Holdings. A potential local partner has been identified who claims to have extensive government connections and can expedite necessary permits and approvals, significantly reducing the time to market. However, whispers in the industry suggest this partner has a history of engaging in questionable business practices, including alleged facilitation payments to secure contracts. As a Kingboard Holdings representative tasked with evaluating this opportunity, which of the following approaches best aligns with regulatory and ethical expectations? Option A. Proceed with the partnership, focusing on the projected financial gains and assuming the whispers are unsubstantiated rumors that do not pose a material risk to Kingboard Holdings. Option B. Immediately reject the partnership due to the alleged questionable practices, without conducting any further investigation into the veracity of these claims or the potential partner's current operations. Option C. Conduct comprehensive due diligence, including a thorough investigation into the potential partner's business practices, compliance history, and reputation, and seek expert legal and compliance advice before making a decision. Option D. Inform the potential partner that Kingboard Holdings is interested, but will only proceed if they can provide documented proof of all past transactions, regardless of their legality at the time. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the partnership, focusing on the projected financial gains and assuming the whispers are unsubstantiated rumors that do not pose a material risk to Kingboard Holdings. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an employee of Kingboard Holdings to navigate a situation where a potential business opportunity, while seemingly lucrative, carries significant reputational and regulatory risks. The core challenge lies in balancing the pursuit of commercial advantage with the imperative to uphold ethical standards and comply with relevant regulations. Careful judgment is required to identify and mitigate these risks before committing to the opportunity. The correct approach involves conducting thorough due diligence that extends beyond financial viability to encompass ethical considerations and regulatory compliance. This includes scrutinizing the proposed partner's business practices, their adherence to anti-bribery and corruption laws, and their overall reputation. By prioritizing a comprehensive risk assessment and seeking appropriate legal and compliance advice, Kingboard Holdings can make an informed decision that protects its integrity and avoids potential legal repercussions. This aligns with the principles of responsible business conduct and the duty of care expected of employees. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the opportunity based solely on the projected financial returns, disregarding the red flags raised by the potential partner's questionable past. This demonstrates a failure to adhere to ethical principles and a disregard for regulatory frameworks designed to prevent illicit activities. Such an approach exposes Kingboard Holdings to significant legal penalties, reputational damage, and potential debarment from future business. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the opportunity outright without any investigation, even if the concerns are based on unsubstantiated rumors. While caution is necessary, a complete lack of due diligence can lead to missed legitimate business opportunities and may not be the most prudent course of action if the concerns can be adequately addressed through further inquiry. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured risk assessment framework. This framework should mandate the identification of potential risks: financial, legal, reputational, ethical, the evaluation of their likelihood and impact, and the development of mitigation strategies. Seeking input from relevant departments such as legal, compliance, and risk management is crucial. Transparency and documentation of the decision-making process are also vital to demonstrate due diligence and accountability. Question 15. The control framework reveals that a senior manager at Kingboard Holdings has received an unsolicited, preliminary indication from a key supplier about a significant, positive development that is likely to materially impact Kingboard Holdings' stock price upon public announcement. The manager believes this development is highly probable and could lead to substantial profits if acted upon promptly. What is the most appropriate and compliant course of action for the senior manager? Option A. Wait for the external supplier to issue a formal public statement before taking any action. Option B. Discuss the potential positive development with trusted colleagues in other departments to gauge their opinions. Option C. Purchase additional Kingboard Holdings shares before the information becomes public. Option D. Immediately report the information to Kingboard Holdings Compliance or Legal Department for assessment and guidance. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the information to Kingboard Holdings Compliance or Legal Department for assessment and guidance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual at Kingboard Holdings to navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure compliance with internal policies and external regulations, specifically concerning the disclosure of material non-public information. The pressure to act quickly based on incomplete information, coupled with the desire to benefit from an anticipated positive development, necessitates a rigorous adherence to established control frameworks. Careful judgment is paramount to avoid insider trading accusations and maintain the company's reputation. The correct approach involves immediately escalating the information to the designated compliance or legal department within Kingboard Holdings. This is the most professionally sound action because it ensures that any potential material non-public information is handled according to established protocols. Regulatory frameworks, such as those governing financial markets and corporate conduct, strictly prohibit the trading of securities based on material non-public information. By reporting the information internally, the individual initiates a formal review process, allowing the company to assess the information's materiality and determine the appropriate course of action, including whether a public announcement is required or if trading restrictions should be imposed. This upholds the principles of fair and orderly markets and protects the company from regulatory penalties and reputational damage. An incorrect approach would be to trade Kingboard Holdings shares based on the anticipated positive news before it is publicly disclosed. This action directly violates regulations against insider trading, as it involves using material non-public information for personal financial gain. Such conduct undermines market integrity and can lead to severe legal consequences, including fines and imprisonment. Another incorrect approach would be to discuss the anticipated news with colleagues who are not part of the designated compliance or legal team, even if they are not directly involved in trading. This constitutes tipping, which is also a form of insider trading. Sharing material non-public information with others who may then trade on it, or who might inadvertently disclose it, creates a significant regulatory risk for both the tipper and the tippee. This breaches the duty of confidentiality and the obligation to prevent the misuse of sensitive corporate information. A further incorrect approach would be to wait for the news to be officially confirmed by the external party before taking any action, even if the internal indication is strong. While confirmation is important, the initial information received could still be considered material and non-public. Delaying escalation in such a situation risks missing the window to properly manage the information flow and could still lead to accusations of selective disclosure or an inability to control the narrative if the information leaks prematurely. The professional decision-making process should involve a clear understanding of the company's internal policies on information handling and a commitment to reporting any potentially sensitive information to the appropriate channels without delay, regardless of personal financial interest or perceived certainty of the outcome. Question 16. Investigation of a potential acquisition target by Kingboard Holdings has revealed sensitive, material, and non-public information during preliminary due diligence. This information, if acted upon, could significantly influence the valuation of the target company and, consequently, the terms of the acquisition. Kingboard Holdings' compliance department is concerned about the potential for insider trading. Which of the following approaches best navigates this situation in adherence to regulatory frameworks and ethical principles? Option A. Disseminate the sensitive, non-public information to all relevant departments within Kingboard Holdings to ensure broad awareness and facilitate a swift decision-making process. Option B. Proceed with the acquisition based on the preliminary information, assuming it will be publicly disclosed as part of the transaction announcement. Option C. Immediately cease all further investigation and abandon the acquisition to avoid any potential regulatory scrutiny. Option D. Continue the due diligence process, meticulously verifying the information's materiality and public availability, and consult with legal and compliance teams to ensure all actions strictly adhere to insider trading regulations before any further steps are taken. Correct answer is B. Proceed with the acquisition based on the preliminary information, assuming it will be publicly disclosed as part of the transaction announcement. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire to secure a competitive advantage and the regulatory obligation to maintain market integrity and prevent insider dealing. Kingboard Holdings, as a publicly listed entity, operates within a strict regulatory environment designed to ensure fair and transparent markets. The challenge lies in balancing legitimate business intelligence gathering with the prohibition of using material non-public information for personal or corporate gain. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between permissible market research and illegal insider trading. The correct approach involves a rigorous internal process that prioritizes compliance with Kingboard Holdings' internal policies and relevant securities regulations. This approach mandates that any information obtained through market research or due diligence must be assessed for its materiality and whether it is publicly available. If the information is deemed material and non-public, it must not be used in any trading decisions or shared with individuals who could act upon it. This aligns with the principles of market fairness and investor protection, preventing any entity from gaining an unfair advantage through privileged information. Specifically, this adheres to the spirit and letter of regulations prohibiting insider dealing, which are designed to maintain confidence in the financial markets. An incorrect approach of proceeding with the acquisition based on the preliminary, non-public information without further verification or public disclosure would constitute a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This action would likely be construed as insider trading, as it involves using material non-public information to make a corporate decision that could impact the company's valuation and stock price. Such a failure breaches the duty of care owed to shareholders and the broader market. Another incorrect approach, that of immediately disclosing the sensitive information to all employees within Kingboard Holdings, would also be a serious breach. This would create a widespread risk of insider trading, as numerous individuals could potentially act on the information before it is made public, thereby undermining market fairness and potentially leading to severe penalties for the company and its employees. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of information control and the severe consequences of information leakage. A third incorrect approach, that of disregarding the information entirely and abandoning the acquisition without further investigation, might seem cautious, but could also be professionally deficient if it stems from an overzealous fear of regulatory scrutiny, rather than a proper assessment of the information's legitimacy and potential impact. While avoiding potential wrongdoing is important, a complete dismissal without due diligence could also represent a failure to act in the best interests of Kingboard Holdings shareholders if the information, once properly vetted, indicated a valuable opportunity. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear framework. 1. Information assessment. Immediately evaluate the nature of the information received. Is it material? Is it public? 2. Regulatory check. Consult internal compliance policies and relevant securities laws to understand the implications of the information. 3. Expert consultation. Engage with legal and compliance departments to get definitive guidance. 4. Controlled dissemination. If the information is deemed legitimate and potentially beneficial, ensure its controlled and lawful dissemination, adhering to all disclosure requirements. 5. Action based on compliance. Only proceed with any corporate action, such as an acquisition, after all regulatory and ethical considerations have been met, and the information is appropriately public or has been handled in a manner that does not constitute insider dealing. Question 17. The risk matrix shows a moderate likelihood of a data privacy breach at Kingboard Holdings, with a severe potential impact on regulatory fines and customer trust. Which of the following represents the most appropriate immediate action for the compliance team? Option A. Monitor the situation closely and gather more data before allocating significant resources to mitigation efforts. Option B. Initiate a comprehensive review of data security protocols and implement enhanced encryption measures, alongside a targeted employee training program on data handling best practices. Option C. Document the risk in the internal risk register and defer action until a more concrete incident occurs. Option D. Focus on mitigating risks with a higher likelihood, even if their potential impact is only moderate. The correct answer is B. Initiate a comprehensive review of data security protocols and implement enhanced encryption measures, alongside a targeted employee training program on data handling best practices. Explanation: this scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual at Kingboard Holdings to interpret a risk matrix in the context of potential regulatory breaches and ethical considerations, without resorting to purely quantitative analysis. The challenge lies in identifying the qualitative implications of the identified risks and determining the appropriate course of action that aligns with regulatory expectations and ethical standards relevant to Kingboard Holdings operations. Careful judgment is required to balance business objectives with compliance obligations. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the identified risks and their potential impact on Kingboard Holdings' regulatory standing and reputation. It necessitates a proactive stance in addressing high-priority risks, which typically manifest as those with a high likelihood and high impact. This approach is right because it demonstrates a commitment to robust risk management and compliance, which are fundamental expectations under relevant regulatory frameworks governing financial services and corporate conduct. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of good governance and the duty to act with integrity, ensuring that Kingboard Holdings operates within legal boundaries and upholds ethical standards. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss or downplay risks that appear less quantifiable or that do not immediately present a clear financial loss. For instance, ignoring a risk with a moderate likelihood but a severe potential impact on reputation or regulatory compliance would be a significant ethical and regulatory failure. This is because regulatory bodies often expect firms to consider not only direct financial risks, but also those that could lead to reputational damage, loss of trust, or significant operational disruption due to non-compliance. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on risks that are easily mitigated with minimal effort, neglecting those that require more substantial investment or strategic change, even if they pose a higher overall threat to the firm's integrity and legal standing. This demonstrates a lack of foresight and a failure to prioritize the firm's long-term health and compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a comprehensive understanding of the risk matrix's qualitative implications. This involves assessing the potential regulatory, legal, ethical, and reputational consequences of each identified risk. The next step is to prioritize risks based on their potential severity and likelihood, focusing on those that pose the greatest threat to Kingboard Holdings' compliance and ethical standing. Finally, professionals must develop and implement appropriate mitigation strategies, ensuring that these strategies are not only effective, but also aligned with the firm's values and regulatory obligations. Question 18. System analysis indicates that Kingboard Holdings is considering a significant acquisition of a competitor. While the potential strategic synergies are substantial, there are whispers of past regulatory noncompliance by the target company that have not been publicly disclosed. What is the most appropriate course of action for Kingboard Holdings to take in this situation? Option A. Inform the relevant regulatory bodies of the rumors of noncompliance and seek their guidance before engaging further with the acquisition. Option B. Proceed with the acquisition immediately to secure the strategic advantage, assuming the target company will rectify any past issues independently. Option C. Conduct a comprehensive due diligence process involving legal and compliance teams to thoroughly investigate the target company's regulatory history and current standing before making any commitment. Option D. Rely on the assurances of the target company's executive team that all past regulatory issues have been resolved and are not material to the acquisition. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the acquisition immediately to secure the strategic advantage, assuming the target company will rectify any past issues independently. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for rapid growth and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Kingboard Holdings, like any publicly listed entity, operates within a defined legal and ethical framework. The challenge lies in balancing business objectives with compliance obligations, particularly when dealing with potentially sensitive information or transactions that could impact market perception and shareholder value. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any strategic decisions are not only commercially sound, but also fully compliant with all applicable regulations, thereby avoiding legal repercussions and reputational damage. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented review of the proposed acquisition by Kingboard Holdings' compliance and legal departments. This process must meticulously assess the target company's regulatory standing, financial health, and any potential conflicts of interest or anti-competitive implications. The justification for this approach lies in its adherence to principles of due diligence and regulatory oversight. Specifically, it aligns with the spirit and letter of corporate governance codes and securities regulations that mandate responsible business conduct, transparency, and the protection of shareholder interests. By conducting a comprehensive review, Kingboard Holdings demonstrates its commitment to operating ethically and legally, minimizing risks associated with mergers and acquisitions. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the acquisition based solely on the perceived strategic benefits, without adequate regulatory scrutiny. This failure stems from a disregard for the established legal framework governing corporate transactions. Such an approach risks violating regulations related to disclosure, antitrust laws, or financial reporting standards, leading to penalties, fines, and significant reputational harm. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on informal assurances from the target company's management regarding compliance without independent verification. This bypasses the essential due diligence process and exposes Kingboard Holdings to undisclosed liabilities or regulatory breaches within the acquired entity, undermining the principle of informed decision-making and robust risk management. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves a structured process of risk assessment, legal review, and internal consultation. Before any significant strategic move, such as an acquisition, a comprehensive due diligence checklist should be followed, involving all relevant departments. This ensures that potential legal, financial, and operational risks are identified and mitigated in accordance with the prevailing regulatory landscape. The ultimate decision should be informed by a clear understanding of the regulatory implications and a commitment to upholding the highest standards of corporate governance. Question 19. When evaluating a preliminary, unconfirmed strategic opportunity for Kingboard Holdings that could significantly impact its market position, what is the most appropriate initial course of action for the senior management team to ensure compliance with relevant securities regulations? Option A. Immediately initiate detailed due diligence and begin preliminary integration planning with the target company to expedite the process. Option B. Disclose the potential opportunity to the market immediately to ensure transparency and avoid any perception of insider information. Option C. Proceed with informal discussions among key executives to gauge initial interest and potential synergies, deferring formal compliance checks until a definitive agreement is closer. Option D. Conduct a thorough internal assessment of the information's materiality and consult with the legal and compliance departments before any further external engagement or internal dissemination beyond a need-to-know basis. The correct answer is A. Immediately initiate detailed due diligence and begin preliminary integration planning with the target company to expedite the process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a company's desire for growth and the stringent regulatory requirements designed to protect investors and market integrity. Kingboard Holdings, like any publicly listed entity, must navigate these regulations meticulously. The challenge lies in balancing commercial objectives with compliance obligations, ensuring that any strategic decision, particularly one involving potential acquisitions or significant financial commitments, adheres strictly to the relevant regulatory framework. This requires a deep understanding of disclosure obligations, insider trading rules, and market abuse prevention. The correct approach involves a thorough and documented internal review process that prioritizes regulatory compliance. This includes assessing the materiality of the information, consulting with legal and compliance departments, and ensuring that any discussions or decisions are made by authorized personnel in a controlled environment. The regulatory justification stems from principles of fair disclosure and market integrity. For instance, if the information about a potential acquisition is deemed material non-public information, MNPI, any premature disclosure or trading based on this information would violate regulations designed to prevent insider dealing and ensure a level playing field for all investors. Adhering to these principles upholds investor confidence and the integrity of the financial markets. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with discussions or internal actions based on the preliminary information without a formal compliance assessment. This could manifest as informal discussions among senior management without involving the compliance team, or making decisions about resource allocation based on the unconfirmed acquisition. The regulatory failure here is the potential breach of rules concerning the handling of MNPI. If such information were to leak, or if trading were to occur based on it, it would constitute market abuse. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the information as insignificant without proper due diligence, potentially overlooking a material event that requires disclosure or careful management. This failure stems from a lack of diligence and a disregard for the potential impact on the company and its stakeholders. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process that begins with identifying potential regulatory implications of any new information or strategic initiative. This involves a proactive engagement with legal and compliance functions, a clear understanding of materiality thresholds, and a commitment to documenting all relevant discussions and decisions. The framework should emphasize a comply-first mentality, where regulatory adherence is not an afterthought but an integral part of the strategic planning and execution process. Question 20. The risk matrix shows a high likelihood and high impact rating for a potential breach of data privacy regulations concerning customer information held by Kingboard Holdings. The proposed mitigation strategy involves a minor update to an existing internal policy document. Based on the regulatory framework and guidelines for the Kingboard Holdings hiring assessment test, which of the following actions represents the most appropriate professional response? Option A. Escalate the issue to a senior management team without proposing any specific course of action, as the risk is complex. Option B. Recommend a comprehensive review of the data privacy mitigation strategy, including an assessment of its adequacy against the specific regulatory requirements and potential for significant investment in enhanced security measures. Option C. Accept the proposed mitigation strategy as sufficient, given that it addresses the identified risk with a minimal update to existing documentation. Option D. Focus on addressing the risks rated as low likelihood and low impact on the matrix, as these are easier to manage. The correct answer is B. Recommend a comprehensive review of the data privacy mitigation strategy, including an assessment of its adequacy against the specific regulatory requirements and potential for significant investment in enhanced security measures. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires an individual at Kingboard Holdings to interpret a risk matrix in the context of potential regulatory breaches and ethical considerations, without resorting to purely quantitative analysis. The pressure to make a swift decision based on a visual representation of risk, while adhering strictly to the Kingboard Holdings hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, demands a nuanced understanding of risk appetite and compliance obligations. The correct approach involves identifying the highest risk rating on the matrix and then evaluating the proposed mitigation strategy against the specific regulatory framework and internal policies of Kingboard Holdings. This approach is right because it prioritizes addressing the most significant potential compliance issues first, aligning with a proactive risk management culture. It demonstrates an understanding that regulatory frameworks often mandate a tiered response to risks, with higher risks requiring more robust controls and immediate attention. This aligns with the principle of know your obligations and acting diligently to prevent breaches, which is a cornerstone of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to focus on the lowest risk rating, assuming it requires no further action. This is ethically and regulatorily flawed because it ignores potential vulnerabilities, even if they appear minor. Regulatory frameworks typically require a comprehensive approach to risk management, not just focusing on the easy wins. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss a high-risk item solely because it is complex to mitigate. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to compliance and an unwillingness to tackle challenging issues, which can lead to significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage for Kingboard Holdings. Finally, an approach that relies on anecdotal evidence or personal opinion rather than the structured information presented in the risk matrix and the defined regulatory framework would be professionally unacceptable, as it lacks objectivity and a basis in established compliance procedures. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the specific regulatory environment applicable to Kingboard Holdings. They should then analyze the risk matrix, not just for the highest or lowest ratings, but for the nature of the risks identified and their potential impact. The next step is to critically evaluate proposed mitigation strategies against both the regulatory requirements and the company's stated risk appetite. This involves asking, does this mitigation adequately address the identified risk within the bounds of our regulatory obligations and ethical standards? If the answer is uncertain, further investigation or consultation with compliance experts is necessary before proceeding.